Benjamin Hayes found her sitting perfectly still on his porch at dawn, wearing a blood-stained wedding dress and staring at the horizon with eyes that held no recognition of the living world around her. When he asked her name, she turned those hollow eyes toward him and said in a voice as empty as winter wind, "I don't think names matter much when you're already dead, but I used to be called Grace before they buried me." What followed would challenge everything Benjamin thought he knew about the boundaries between life and death, sanity and madness, and whether a soul could truly die while the body still drew breath. But to understand how a woman who believed she was a walking corpse ended up changing the life of a man who had already given up on hope, I need to tell you about the morning Benjamin Hayes discovered that sometimes the most broken people are the ones who can teach us how to live again. Benjamin had been alone on his ranch in the Wyoming Territory for 3 years, ever since the influenza outbreak of 1884 had taken his wife Sarah and their twin daughters within the same week. At 38, he'd become a ghost of his former self, going through the motions of ranch life with mechanical precision, but feeling as disconnected from the world as if he were watching his own life from a great distance. The two-story ranch house that had once echoed with children's laughter and his wife's singing now stood silent, except for the wind that howled through the gaps in the walls during the brutal Wyoming winters. Benjamin spoke to no one except the occasional traveling merchant, and even then, only when necessary to conduct business. He'd stopped going to church, stopped visiting neighbors, and stopped believing that life held anything beyond the daily routine of feeding cattle, mending fences, and surviving one day at a time. In many ways, Benjamin Hayes was as dead inside as the woman he would find on his porch that October morning in 1887. He'd risen before sunrise, as was his habit, to check on the horses and ensure that none had been spooked by the pack of wolves that had been prowling the area for weeks. The early morning air was crisp with the promise of winter, and frost covered the wooden planks of his porch like a delicate shroud. It was when he stepped outside to draw water from the well that he saw her. She sat in his rocking chair, as if she belonged there, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap with the composed stillness of someone posing for a portrait. The wedding dress she wore had once been beautiful, made of fine white lace and silk, but it was now torn and stained with dark spots that could only be blood. Her auburn hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her skin was pale to the point of being translucent, with blue veins visible beneath the surface like ink beneath parchment. But it was her eyes that stopped Benjamin cold. Eyes that looked at the world without really seeing it, as if she were looking through everything around her toward something infinitely distant. "Ma'am," Benjamin said carefully, setting down his water bucket and approaching the porch slowly, the way he might approach a wild animal that could bolt at any sudden movement. She turned her head toward him with the deliberate precision of a clockwork mechanism, and when she spoke, her voice was so soft he had to strain to hear it. "I hope you don't mind that I sat down," she said with eerie politeness. "I've been walking for such a long time, and the dead get tired too, I think." Benjamin felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Ma'am, you're not dead. You're sitting right here talking to me." A smile ghosted across her lips, but it held no warmth or recognition. "That's what I thought too at first. But I've been thinking about it for days now, and I'm quite certain I died sometime after the wedding. I remember the ceremony. I remember saying the vows, but everything after that is just empty." She gestured vaguely at her stained dress. "This is what I was wearing when it happened, whatever it was. I suppose that means I'm buried somewhere in this same dress, and this is just my spirit wandering around, confused about where it's supposed to go." Benjamin studied her face, looking for signs of fever or delirium that might explain her strange beliefs, but her eyes were clear and her speech was lucid. Whatever had convinced her that she was dead, it wasn't a physical illness. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Grace Whitfield," she replied. "At least that was my name when I was alive. I'm not sure what dead people are called." Benjamin spent the next hour trying to convince Grace to come inside the house, but she refused with the quiet stubbornness of someone who had already made peace with what she believed to be her fate. "Dead people don't belong in houses meant for the living," she explained with the same matter-of-fact tone she might use to discuss the weather. It wouldn't be proper. Instead, she remained on the porch, accepting the blanket he brought her, but insisting that she couldn't feel the cold anyway. Benjamin found himself in the strange position of having breakfast with someone who insisted she didn't need food because corpses don't get hungry, yet who ate the biscuits and coffee he offered with the mechanical precision of someone going through familiar motions. "Grace," Benjamin said carefully as he sat across from her on the porch steps, "can you tell me what you remember about your wedding day?" Her hands stilled on the coffee cup, and for a moment something flickered behind her empty eyes. A flash of pain so raw and immediate that it made Benjamin's chest tighten with recognition. He'd seen that same look in his own mirror for 3 years, the expression of someone whose soul had been shattered by loss. "I remember walking down the aisle," she said slowly, her voice taking on a distant quality as if she were reciting someone else's memories. "The church was full of people and everyone was smiling. My father gave me away to Thomas, and Thomas looked so handsome in his new suit." She paused, staring at the bloodstains on her dress. "We said our vows, and I promised to love and honor him until death do us part. I remember thinking that nothing could ever separate us, that we would grow old together and watch our children have children." Benjamin waited, sensing that she was approaching something crucial. The reception was beautiful. Everyone was dancing and laughing, and I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. Grace's voice began to crack, and tears started rolling down her cheeks, though her expression remained eerily calm. "Then Thomas said he wanted to show me something special, something he'd prepared just for our wedding night." The silence that followed was so heavy that Benjamin could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. "He took me to the room he'd prepared," Grace continued, her voice becoming smaller and more fragile. "But it wasn't what I expected. There were ropes and things that were meant to hurt, and when I tried to leave, he said that wives were supposed to obey their husbands in all things, and that God wanted women to suffer for the sin of Eve." Benjamin felt sick to his stomach as he began to understand what had broken this young woman's mind. "I fought him," Grace whispered. "I fought as hard as I could, but he was so much stronger than me. And when it was over, when he was finished with what he wanted to do, he told me that this was going to be my life now, every night, for as long as I lived." She looked directly at Benjamin for the first time since she'd started talking. "That's when I knew I had to die. Not my body, because I was too much of a coward for that, but everything inside me that made me Grace. I think I succeeded, because I don't feel like a person anymore." Benjamin had to swallow hard before he could speak. "Grace, what happened to you was terrible, but it doesn't mean you're dead. It means you're hurt. And hurt people can heal if they're given time and care." "Can they?" she asked with genuine curiosity. "Because I've been walking for 6 days now, ever since I climbed out the bedroom window and ran away, and I haven't felt anything except empty. No hunger, no thirst, no pain, no hope. If that's not being dead, what is it?" Benjamin stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the vast expanse of prairie that stretched to the horizon. He'd asked himself the same question for 3 years, wondering if what he'd been experiencing since losing his family could really be called living. "I think," he said slowly, "that sometimes when life hurts us too much, our souls go into hiding to protect themselves. But hiding isn't the same as dying." Grace considered this with the serious attention of someone weighing a scientific theory. "How would you know if your soul came out of hiding?" "I don't know," Benjamin admitted. "I've been looking for the answer to that question for a long time myself." That afternoon, Benjamin set up a bedroll for Grace on the covered porch, respecting her belief that she couldn't enter the house, but determined to ensure she had some protection from the elements. Grace accepted his care with the passive gratitude of someone who didn't believe she deserved kindness, but was too polite to refuse it. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Benjamin of better times, Grace spoke again. "Benjamin," she said, using his name for the first time, "if you've been looking for your soul for 3 years, does that mean you think you're dead too?" The question hit Benjamin like a physical blow, because it was one he'd never allowed himself to ask directly. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Maybe we're both ghosts and that's why we found each other." The first sign that Grace might not be as dead as she believed came 3 days later, when Benjamin found her standing in his vegetable garden at dawn, tears streaming down her face as she stared at a patch of sunflowers that his wife Sarah had planted 4 years earlier, and that continued to bloom every summer despite being completely neglected. "They're beautiful," Grace whispered when she noticed Benjamin approaching. "I didn't think I could see beauty anymore, but these flowers are so alive, so joyful. Is it wrong for a dead person to appreciate something like that?" Benjamin knelt beside the sunflowers, remembering how Sarah had planted them because she said they reminded her of hope, always turning their faces toward the light no matter what darkness surrounded them. "Sarah planted these," he said softly. "My wife. She said sunflowers were proof that even in the hardest ground, beautiful things could grow if they had enough light." Grace knelt beside him, careful not to disturb the flowers. "What happened to her?" "Influenza took her and our daughters, Emma and Rose, during the outbreak 3 years ago. I buried all 3 of them in the same week." Benjamin's voice was steady, but Grace could see the pain that lived just beneath the surface. "I used to come out here and talk to Sarah through these flowers, but after a while I stopped believing she could hear me." "Maybe she can," Grace said quietly. "Maybe the dead stay close to the things they loved." Benjamin looked at her with surprise. "Yesterday you said dead people don't belong among the living." Grace touched one of the sunflower petals with gentle reverence. "Maybe I was wrong about that. Maybe the dead and the living need each other more than I thought." Over the following days, a routine developed between them that neither discussed, but both seemed to understand. Benjamin would tend to his ranch work while Grace maintained a respectful distance, usually sitting on the porch or walking slowly around the property boundaries. But gradually, she began to participate in small ways, feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, helping to hang laundry on the line. "Dead people don't need to do chores," Benjamin observed one afternoon as he watched Grace carefully mending a torn shirt with stitches so precise they looked like they'd been done by a professional seamstress. "Maybe not," Grace replied, "but it feels good to make something better instead of just watching everything fall apart." Benjamin realized that Grace's belief in her own death was beginning to crack around the edges, revealing glimpses of the woman she'd been before trauma had convinced her that survival meant spiritual suicide. The breakthrough came during their second week together, when a severe thunderstorm hit the ranch with winds strong enough to knock down fence posts and hail large enough to injure the livestock. Benjamin was struggling to get his horses into the barn when he heard Grace scream. Not the empty sound he might have expected from someone who claimed to feel nothing, but a cry of genuine terror. He found her huddled behind the water trough, shaking violently as lightning illuminated the sky and thunder shook the ground beneath them. "Grace," he called over the storm, rushing to her side. "What's wrong?" "The noise," she gasped, covering her ears with her hands. "It sounds like him, like Thomas when he was angry. I know it's just thunder, but I can't make my body understand that. Benjamin knelt beside her and carefully, slowly placed his hands over hers. You're safe, he said firmly. No one is going to hurt you here. I promise. Grace looked at him with eyes that were suddenly very much alive, very much human, and very much afraid. But I thought I couldn't feel fear anymore. I thought I was dead. Fear means you're alive, Grace. Dead people don't protect themselves from danger because they don't have anything left to lose. But you do. As the storm raged around them, Benjamin helped Grace into the barn where the horses provided warmth, and the thick walls muffled the worst of the thunder. They sat together in the hay while rain drummed against the roof, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Grace talked about her life before the wedding that had changed everything. She'd been a school teacher in a small town in Colorado, she told him. She'd loved reading to children and watching their faces light up when they mastered a difficult lesson. She'd had dreams of maybe writing books someday, stories that would help children understand that the world could be beautiful even when it was difficult. Thomas seemed so kind when he was courting me, she said quietly. He brought me flowers and told me I was the most intelligent woman he'd ever met. He said he wanted a wife who could think for herself and help him build something meaningful. What changed? Benjamin asked. I think he was always the way he was on our wedding night. I think the kindness was just a performance to get what he wanted. But I was so lonely, and I wanted so badly to believe that someone could love me, that I ignored the signs. Benjamin understood that feeling intimately. After losing Sarah, he'd been so desperate for any connection to another human being that he'd almost married a woman from town who'd made it clear she was only interested in his property, not in him. Grace, he said carefully, you said you've been walking for days since you left Thomas. Have you thought about what you want to do next? Grace was quiet for so long that Benjamin thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was stronger than he'd heard it since she arrived. I want to feel alive again, she said. I don't know how, and I don't know if it's possible, but I want to try. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but over the next 2 months, Benjamin watched Grace slowly reclaim pieces of herself that she'd thought were lost forever. She started by asking him to teach her practical skills that Thomas had forbidden her to learn. How to ride a horse, how to shoot a rifle, how to brand cattle and mend fences. Each new ability seemed to add another layer of strength to the foundation. She was rebuilding. I want to know that I can take care of myself, she explained one afternoon as she practiced loading and firing Benjamin's old cavalry rifle. I never want to be helpless again. Benjamin had written to the territorial marshal about Grace's situation, and the response had been both encouraging and sobering. Thomas Whitfield was wanted for questioning in connection with 2 other missing brides, women who had disappeared after marrying him in similar circumstances. Grace's testimony could help ensure that he faced justice for what he'd done. Will you testify against him? Benjamin asked when he shared the marshal's letter with her. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she held the paper, but her voice was steady. Yes, not just for me, but for the other women who might not have been strong enough to run away. The day Grace decided to cut her hair was the day Benjamin knew she had truly chosen to live again. She stood in front of the mirror in his kitchen, holding the scissors with determination. Grace, Benjamin said carefully, you don't have to change anything about yourself. You're perfect as you are. I'm not changing myself, Grace replied, meeting his eyes in the mirror. I'm becoming myself. This hair, this length, it was what Thomas wanted. Everything about how I looked was what he chose. I want to see what I look like when I get to decide. When she finished cutting, her auburn hair fell just below her shoulders in a style that framed her face and made her eyes look larger and more alive than Benjamin had ever seen them. What do you think? She asked, turning to face him. I think "You look like Grace," Benjamin said honestly. "The real Grace, not the one anyone else tried to create." That evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Grace asked Benjamin a question that had been building between them for weeks. "What are you going to do when I leave?" she said. Quietly, Benjamin felt his heart skip a beat. "Are you planning to leave?" "I don't know. I've been thinking that maybe I should go back to teaching, maybe in a different state where no one knows what happened to me. But I also think about staying here, about helping you bring this ranch back to life the way you've helped me come back to life." Benjamin set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly. "Grace, I need you to know that you don't owe me anything. You're free to make whatever choice feels right to you." "I know that," Grace said. "That's what makes this choice real. For the first time in my life, I get to decide what I want, based on what makes me happy, not what someone else expects of me." "And what makes you happy?" Grace smiled, and it was the first smile Benjamin had seen from her that reached all the way to her eyes. "This sitting here with someone who sees me as a person worth knowing, working alongside someone who trusts me to be strong, building something good with someone who understands that healing takes time." 6 months later, Grace Whitfield became Grace Hayes in a small ceremony attended by neighbors who had come to respect the quiet woman who had helped Benjamin transform his grieving ranch back into a place of life and hope. The wedding dress she wore was simple blue cotton that she had sewn herself, and instead of a church, they were married under the sunflowers that Sarah had planted and that Grace now tended with loving care. Thomas Whitfield was eventually captured and sentenced to prison, where he died 2 years later under circumstances that the guards described as natural causes, but that the other prisoners understood as justice delivered by men who had daughters of their own. Benjamin and Grace never had children, but their ranch became a sanctuary for women escaping situations like Grace's, and for men who had lost their way after tragedy. They learned that sometimes the most profound form of resurrection isn't rising from the dead, but choosing to fully live after trauma has convinced you that life is no longer possible. The woman who had once believed she was dead became living, proof that with patience, kindness, and courage, even the most shattered souls can learn to bloom again. If this story of healing and second chances touched your heart and reminded you that trauma doesn't have to define us forever, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that it's never too late to choose life over mere survival. What's your most powerful story of finding hope after devastating loss? Share it in the comments below. Your experience might inspire our next video. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most broken people are the ones who can teach us the most about what it truly means to live.